Hi, everybody. Welcome. We'll just wait a couple of minutes so that more participants can join us. Okay, I believe we can start. Good afternoon, everybody. I am very happy to welcome you all to today's discussion. My name is Andaya, and I am a consultant for Habitat for Humanity based in sunny Lisbon today. So for those of you who are not familiar with the organization, Habitat for Humanity is an international NGO focused on helping individuals and families achieve the strength, stability, and self-reliance through decent and affordable shelter. Today, Habitat is working in more than 70 countries, including in Africa and EU member states. I'll just, first of all, introduce you to some housekeeping rules. Participants will be muted and the camera will not show you. So I could not encourage you enough to use the chat box for any questions to our speakers or comments. You can find the chat box on this right side of your screen. This discussion today is the third and the last of a webinar series called Building on Solid Ground for the Africa-EU Partnership. It is organized in the context of the Build Solid Ground project, financed by the European Development Education and Awareness Raising Program. So we had a first session by the end of February on best practices on housing and urban renewal in Africa, and the second discussion in the beginning of March, addressing the challenges and opportunities of the sector in the context of the Africa-EU relationship. We have records for both webinars that will be publicly available soon, but please do not hesitate to let us know if you want to access them meanwhile. Before I introduce you to our great lineup of speakers, who you can already see on your screen, I'll just like to briefly remind us of why is it important for us to have this discussion today. So 2021 is a key year. On the one hand, EU and Africa are reframing their new alliances, while the EU is also starting its new long-term funding cycle. These changes are occurring in a context that is dealing with an unprecedented pandemic. And meanwhile, we have less than 10 years to advance the SDGs and try to make the world a better place. This is also why we aim to show that housing is central to the wider development picture. So it is not just about having a roof over one's head, it is about enjoying the right to live in safety, stability, and dignity in a decent home. The pandemic even stressed more this important element, as housing was the front line of defense against COVID-19. Today, during our discussion, we're also going to show you that the right to adequate housing is an important element of core principles of the 2030 Agenda. Just as a brief reminder, these include universality, indivisibility, inclusiveness, and partnerships, among others. We invite you to keep these principles in mind throughout our discussion. But now let me please introduce you to our amazing speakers. Hello, everybody. I'll just go alphabetically. So I'll start with Paolo Ciccarelli, who is an architect specialized in development cooperation with more than 35 years of experience in managing infrastructure projects in Europe and Africa. Paolo has spent more than 25 years with the European Commission, where he has gained experience in policy and strategy negotiation in international forums and project management for the urban development, water, and transport sectors. Paolo is now head of unit Sustainable Transport and Urban Development of DJ INTPA, or DJ for International Partnerships. Paolo, you'll tell us more about the Commission's vision today. Thank you so much for joining us. William Cobbett, or Billy, is the director of Cities Alliance, a global partnership promoting the role of cities in sustainable development. Before this, Billy was acting chief at the Shelter branch of UN Habitat in Nairobi. And before that, in South Africa, Billy managed Plan Act, a leading urban NGO, and then moved on to the African National Congress, where he represented the ANC on the National Housing Forum. Billy was also appointed Director General for the National Department of Housing in the Government of National Unity under President Mandela. We can't wait to hear your take today. Dr. Leah Kosgei is a PhD sociologist and housing expert. Her research fields are the sociology of urban planning, housing poverty, and housing policies. She has also worked as a consultant in national, urban, and regional development programs. Also worked with the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights and Inequality in Housing, and as an advocacy officer for Habitat for Humanity in Hungary. Now she's a research fellow of the Institute for Sociology, Center for Social Sciences in Budapest. And today, Leah, you'll guide us through some of your main research findings. Martina Lieberman is an urban planner and head of the sector program City, which supports the sector division called Environmental Policy, Urban Development, Mobility, Circular Economy, Marine Conservation of BMZ, or the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany, and they do so through policy advice on urban development. Martina has been active in German development cooperation since '98, with different postings from German Development Service and GIZ. And since 2015, Martina is working in the Global Department of GIZ in Bonn, which started supporting BMZ in the Habitat 3 process. Today, Martina, you'll be representing GIZ and also tell us more about BMZ policies. Dr. Claude Ngomti is a regional advisor for Central Africa, Madagascar, Guinea, and Mauritania at the Regional Office of UN Habitat in Nairobi. He has extensive experience in areas including urban planning and policy, housing and urban development strategies in 16 African countries, plus Kuwait, Canada, and Spain. Before, Claude served as advisor in charge of French-speaking African countries, was responsible for the Safer Cities program for Francophone countries, and led the Global Policy Platform for Urban Development, among many others. Claude, welcome. You will tell us more today about UN Habitat's vision. Dr. Katerina Schula has a background in architecture and urban planning and public administration. As a PhD, she has worked for the Albanian Ministry of Urban Development. She has also established the Regional Center of Expertise on Education for Sustainable Development in Middle Albania, one of the so-called RCEs, which is acknowledged by the UN University in Japan. Currently, Katerina is an associate researcher at ZEF, Center for Development Research at University of Bonn in Germany. Katerina, you will be introducing us to one of the key publications launched today. Dr. Stephen Weidsten is a human geographer, political economist, and qualitative social science with wide range research, teaching, and consultancy interests related to urban transformations. He has more than 25 years of professional experience in academic, policy, and private sectors across Germany, Australia, and New Zealand. He is currently an adjunct research fellow at the School of Agriculture and Environment at the University of Western Australia. He is also an URBACT lead expert for a 10-city pan-European consortium that mobilizes corporate social responsibility for better urban outcomes. Stefan, welcome. You will guide us through some of your main research findings. Last but not least, Christopher Vincent. Very welcome. He's the Vice President of Government Relations and Advocacy for Habitat for Humanities, based in Washington. Christopher is part of the senior leadership team of Habitat and responsible for overseeing advocacy efforts directed at US and international public policy. He has a long-standing career in Habitat, including in Latin American Caribbean region for 3 years, and positions of partnership development, coalition engagement, and advocacy capacity building. Christopher today also sits on the boards of IHC Global and Cadasta, and participates in the newly formed Costs of Home campaign cabinet. Christopher, you will guide us through some of the main takeaways of today's discussion by closing the session. Welcome, everybody. We would like to start our discussion today by introducing you all to 3 new publications from Habitat for Humanity. You will find a link to the first publication we would like to address on the chat, which is a progress report on SDG 11.1. Leah, could you please guide us through the key findings of this publication, please?
Yes, thank you. And if I'm correct, then yes, here's the presentation. So good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to present the key findings of this publication, which is a progress report about SDG 11 target 11.1 by 2030, ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. I made this report with my colleague Katarina Schul. She will present our other paper today. Next slide, please. Thank you. First of all, I would like to stress very much that we are talking about a regressing target, which is, I think, quite striking. So instead of progress, we see regress on this target. By 2018, the share of urban population living in slum-like housing increased. And by now, in fact, every 4 urban residents live in slum housing. SDG 11 was subject to the high-level the high-level political forum in 2018. There, out of the 35 targets which had enough data for tracking, only 5 targets were regressing, and one of these targets was this target 11.1. So we see regress in this target, which is, I think, a very problematic thing, and we have to emphasize it. Right. Next slide, please. I also want to discuss a bit regional trends behind the global data, because in fact there are differences between regions. Between 2000 and 2014, before the Agenda 2030, we see some progress actually in all regions, a proportional progress. You can see it in the lighter bars. And from 2014, we see global regress, and this global regress is mainly the result of a changed significant changes, trend changes in some regions, notably Northern Africa and Western Asia. You can see that instead of a decrease in the number of proportion of slum dwellers, we see an increase. And also in sub-Saharan Africa, we see an increase. And also in other regions, what we see is that in the preceding years, we saw quite good progress. I mean, it was really decreasing. And now this decrease is much smaller. So this is behind the global data. So the most problematic trends we see in Northern Africa and Western Asia, and to some extent in sub-Saharan Africa, but all other regions fail to continue the progress we saw earlier. Next slide, please. We also have to talk about not only the proportion of slum dwellers, but also the sheer number, the absolute number of these people. And what we see is that even when we saw proportional decrease because of macro trends like ongoing urbanization primarily, even when there was this proportional regress, we see the absolute number increasing and increasing and increasing. So this is highly problematic, and by 2018 there are over 1 billion people living in slum-like housing. Also, we see some regional differences. I want to highlight here Sub-Saharan Africa, where more than 50% of urban dwellers live in slum-like housing conditions, and it also means well over 200 million people, nearly 240 million people. And also in Central and Southern Asia and Eastern and Southeastern Asia, the proportion of slum dwellers is a bit smaller, but the population size of slum dwellers is very significant in these areas. Next slide, please. Thank you. If we look just a bit, go a bit in the sub-regional level, we see that the highest increase in countries from 2014 is seen in countries hit by political unrest and economic crisis like Syria or Myanmar or Colombia, Venezuela, Honduras or Guinea. So it seems that this seems to be a major factor in increasing slum dweller population proportionally. And also we see proportional increase in countries which already have the largest number of urban slum populations, notably India and Indonesia. But we also have some good examples in various regions, and some good examples are included in the progress report. Next slide, please. So far, I was talking about the proportion and number of urban slum dwellers, but in fact, this indicator has two components. The other component is housing affordability, because the indicator tried to reflect the more comprehensive manner housing is understood in the Agenda 2030. So it tried to grasp further aspects of housing inadequacy. And this is intended to be grasped by housing affordability. This is another type of housing problem, and it's quite effective. It can quite effectively complement the knowledge about slum dwellers if we have additional information about people with housing affordability problems. Now, the only problem is that at present there is a lack of updated global data on affordability. So we don't really know how many people are really affected by these problems. We see data on slum households, but we don't see data concerning this only blue part of this figure, those households which are not slum households but experience serious affordability problems. And also there was, if I understood it correctly, there are plans to make a composite index, but so far no such index is available. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, we try to map affordability data based on earlier data. The UN Habitat itself talked about the global housing unaffordability crisis. For instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, more than 50% of urban dwellers lives in unaffordable housing. And I also want to emphasize, if you look at the bottom bars in this figure, that this phenomenon is present in developed countries, developed regions and developed countries as well. So this is a really global problem. Next slide, please. We try to identify some critical issues and recommendations. You can go on with the slide. Thank you. The first critical issue we found is that housing is actually not prioritized in interventions. To put it very simply, sometimes it's much easier to make some infrastructure investment than to enter into this highly complex problem of slum housing and do something with it. And as a recommendation, we put that we have to position housing at the center of interventions, and we have to make efforts to make this perspective change. We might talk about it later in the discussion. The other critical issue was that there's a lack of recognition of the complexity of the housing ecosystem. So it has many stakeholders, many processes, and it's really highly complex. But if we don't take it into account, we will fail in our intervention. So we must apply a housing ecosystem perspective. The third one was the lack of meaningful cooperation between key stakeholders. And this is also it's a complex issue. Just as an example, I would like to highlight how the national and local governments are sometimes unable to cooperate in interventions, and also how local governments and other actors fail to meaningfully cooperate with local the local community. So our recommendation is to build and maintain strong public-private partnerships, and I would also stress maintain, not only build them, but maintain it, institutionalize it if that's relevant. There's an underreporting, and also there are limitations of data collections. I already mentioned the lack of affordability data. Also, countries and cities tend to underreport their problems in terms of inadequate housing, which is, among others, this is a problem because proper reporting, and this is our recommendation, improved data collection, monitoring, and reporting, it would drive the attention of donors and other important bodies on this problem, and would enhance it would help to find sources and all kinds of resources for such programs. Also, we see a big funding gap generally for SDG 11, but also for this type of intervention. So I think we should stress that adequate funding is needed. Again, what we see is an increasing number of slum dwellers. So if we don't do anything, we don't provide adequate funding, or we continue with our existing practices, this will not stop. It will only get more and more and more. And as the final critical issue and recommendation, SDGs are interconnected. So if there's regressing related SDGs, for example, SDG 8, employment, if there's a regress, it will affect housing. So we should recognize the interconnectedness of housing with other SDGs. And this is the point where I will stop and give the floor to my colleague, Katerina. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leah. Indeed, we would now like to share with you a link to the second publication that relates to this interconnectedness between SDGs, and invite Katerina, please. Can you tell us more about these links?
Good afternoon, everybody. Do you hear me? Is everything okay?
Yes, very well. Yes, thank you.
I will present the booklet for housing and sustainable development goals. This booklet shows the importance that housing has for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. That is meant to fill the gap, that knowledge gap that exists, but also as a starting point for measuring the housing impact through the SDGs targets and indicators monitoring framework. Next slide, please. So, the booklet is a guide for understanding the transformational impact of housing on the SDGs. It contains a section about illustration with these explanations about these interconnections, case study summaries from examples from all around the world, and a list of selected targets and indicators which are mostly related to the housing. Also, the importance of housing for other development agendas, such as the new urban agenda, Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, Paris Climate Agreement. Next slide, please. So housing is the catalyst of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. 2030 Agenda is indivisible. The goals cannot be implemented alone. So SDGs are interdependent, interconnected, and actions in one goal can have influence, positive or negative, towards the achievements of other SDGs. Housing contributes directly or indirectly to the implementation of all the SDGs. It is an integrated part of 6 SDGs, has direct contribution to 7 SDGs, and indirect contribution to the 4 remaining SDGs. Next slide, please. So housing is a prerequisite for inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities, which is the focus of SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities. The target 11.1 of housing can support the implementation of this goal of SDG 11 through practices, for example, housing at the center, which is promoted by UN Habitat and contributes to integrated approach toward urban planning and management, through upgrading and prevention of slums, which is a prerequisite for safer cities, Housing affordability can ensure sustainable cities and communities. And furthermore, this target can also contribute to localizing SDGs because it can gather stakeholders, local stakeholders, toward partnerships with focus on housing. Implementation of this target will also contribute to the implementation of other targets. It's okay, we can continue on the other slide, yeah. So apart from SDG 11, housing is an integrated part of 5 more SDGs, and adequate and affordable housing, of course, can reduce economic vulnerability, which contribute directly to SDG 1, no poverty. Inadequate and unaffordable housing can compromise physical and mental health, contributing to SDG 3, health and well-being. Also, equal access to housing can empower women and protect them from discrimination, and this can contribute to SDG 5, gender equality. Water and sanitation are 2 criteria that define adequate housing, and these are the 2 core elements of SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. Energy poverty is a form of housing poverty. High energy costs can lead to unaffordable housing, but also interventions in housing can reduce the energy loss or can reach a more energy efficiency, which can contribute to SDG 7. Next slide, please. Housing has direct impact on 7 SDGs. So housing sector supports economic growth through job creation. New building and technologies can increase innovation and contribute into SDG 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure. Housing inequalities define social and economic inequality. For example, slums or informal settlements are often especially concentrated, and this can divide the cities. Sustainable building can reduce resource consumption. As we know, the construction sector is one of the more consumer of raw materials, but by directing the building towards sustainability, design and implementation, this impact can be minimized. Resilient housing can protect against natural disasters. Also, zero energy efficiency housing can have much less impact in climate change. And tenure security and informal settlements recognition can promote participation of vulnerable groups on decision-making, which contribute to the implementation of SDG 16 related to strong institutions. Housing-focused initiatives can also ensure inclusive public-private partnerships, which is related to Goal 17, partnerships for the goals. Next slide, please. Housing has indirect impact on the 4 remaining SDGs. So reducing housing costs can increase the disposable income of costs that households spend for food. Adequate living conditions can enable better education outcomes. Sustainable urban planning and slum upgrading can protect water resources, contributing this way to SDG 14, life underwater. Sustainable urban planning protects ecosystems from damages caused, for example, from scatter or informal settlements or illegal buildings, which are mostly built in unfavorable locations, and in this way contributing to SDG 15, life on land. More information about these connections, of course, can be found in the booklet, and I hope it will be useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katerina. You really showed us that when we talk about housing, we're not singling out one SDG, it is really about the full picture. So this is where I would also like to bring our 3rd publication being launched today, which you can now find in the chat. And Stefan, I'm turning to you now. So if in normal conditions, we would need to accelerate action for SDG 11 as a key driver of change for the full SDG set, your research shows that we can now also turn a crisis into an opportunity. Can you please tell us more about that?
Sure. Thank you, Andrea. Does it work? Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Very well. Yes. Thank you.
Good, good. Thank you. Yes, if you could go to slide 1, please. Next slide. Thank you. So when we think about the pandemic, then we have to acknowledge that we actually went into the pandemic already with some actual real issues around housing. So when we look around the world, we see that almost each country comes in with a severe housing gap. That's same true for Africa as it is for countries here in Europe or in other parts of the world. We also have to acknowledge that in many developing countries, housing actually is a lot about informal housing, which requires particular policy responses and particular ways of dealing with the issues. we also see the increasing trend of flagship developments, big money developments where we see good outcomes. But the question here is, of course, who actually benefits? Does it really filter through to lower income and poorer populations? Another key trend, I would say, is the now widely acknowledged bottom-up self-help practices that we know that if we help communities and people to be resilient, to be strong, that actually produces good outcomes, and we see some also governmental action on this one. Of course, we have those bigger trajectories over the last couple of decades, ranging from formal planning to incremental housing approaches to perhaps lately also satellite developments, especially in relation to Chinese investment. So I guess big question here is what happens in the next couple of years? What kind of trajectories do we want to embark on? But we also can be very proud and positive about many emerging good and best practices. And I refer to recent compendium of best practices from Habitat for Humanity, which is available now also publicly. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. The pandemic, of course, changes again quite a number of things. I think probably the most important impact now we feel in the area of health. It's of course physical health that's on our mind, but we also have to acknowledge the longer-term impact of mental health problems around the world, and we can feel it already also here in Europe. Housing also during the pandemic has really become the center of life. It has become the the site where people not just live but also now work, socialize, a very intensified domestic life, I would call it. But that puts on the flip side the spotlight on those people who do not have homes, like the homeless, the rough sleepers, or people who have underserviced housing. But also it puts the spotlight on affordability problems that are now widespread around the world. We just heard it before. On a bigger scheme, it raises at the moment bigger questions on financing. Who pays the bills for the housing and other development needs over the next couple of years? If you look at municipalities, if you look at subnational governments, we actually feel that there's a municipal squeeze. There's more work to do, arguably more work, but with less finance, because at the moment the actual funding, the rate and tax-based funding, but also the intergovernmental transfers at the moment create gaps, and we really have to think about how to pay the bills over the next couple of years. It was also talked about just before that we are actually regressing, and if you think about poverty reduction overall, then the World Bank acknowledges that we are in a process of regression, and that's a big challenge. And that also unfortunately is true for some SDG goals. So we really see that COVID-19 is an accelerator of pre-existing trends, but also puts new issues on the map. Thank you. The next one, please. Yeah, thank you very much. I came up with this publication for Habitat for Humanity with what I call the value system of housing, almost like a bit of a guide how to think about housing in post-pandemic years. So if you look at in the center, it's post-pandemic housing, developing countries, and around this is a nice little, I guess, circle of 5 key areas or key angles into housing. Number 1, basic need and human right. And number 2, housing as a home. Number 3, housing as a sector, producing incomes and jobs. Housing as an environment and planet preserving tool, number 4, and housing as development, number 5. We talk about this in a second. But I would like to refer to the outer 4 quarters, the outer 4 boxes, which represent the key outcome areas taken from the United Nations, but also I added one to it. So if you think about equity as an important outcome area, or the interdependence between people, then housing has an important role to play here. If you think about sustainability, then it's about interdependence between generations. If you think about resilience, the buzzword of our times, then it's about interdependence between systems. And I added a 4th dimension to it, which I think is really important, and that is trust in the right bottom corner, because trust at the end of the day is the glue that binds our communities together, creates the synergies and the capabilities that we need to actually enforce all those other areas. Thank you. Next one, please. Thanks. So very quickly, I want to look through those 5 key intervention areas around housing. So if we think about housing as a basic need, surely the pandemic shows us, if we have not known it before, that housing is not just an investment tool, but really it has a basic human need function, and with that comes the importance of safeguarding it as a fundamental right. So this is about protecting the most vulnerable. It's about recognizing the land rights continuum as an important normative and conceptual marker. It's about investing in services, water, sanitation, upgrades, and it's overall protecting the advocacy of housing. If we think about number 2, housing as a home, then it's very important to recognize that we home for people and families is really what matters when we think about the relationship building, if we think about soft skill development, if we think about how people actually learn to be humans in many ways. So this is a very important aspect, and it also cuts through those cultural dimensions. So we have to make sure that housing as a home includes cultural sensitive interventions and provides the ontological security people crave for. Those biographical.
Stephen,
yeah.
I think we are lagging behind with the slides. Can you check that, please? I think we should be on.
No, I think we're still okay. We're still okay.
Still okay? Okay.
Yes, we're still okay. Thanks, Julie. No. Number 3, it's about housing as a sector. And here I just want to remind us, all of us, that housing has always, during times of crisis, been an important tool, if governments use this tool, an important tool to rebuild and to stimulate the economy and to get populations out of crisis. So we know, for example, if you look at Japan after 45, if you look at New Zealand in the 30s, if you look at the Asian tiger states in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and if even Australia in 2009-10 during the GFC, that housing has an important role to play in re-stimulating the economy, getting people into jobs, and getting people back on track in terms of prosperity building and future building. Number 4, development. This is a key, of course, to our purposes. Here it's a lot about spatial development, territorial development. It's about thinking about how to use also best practices, how to build perhaps better knowledge and wisdom circuits to support good interventions in order to help housing to create better outcomes for all of us. Number 5, obviously extremely topical, especially also to the European Union. Housing as an active tool to, well, on the one hand, cool down our planet and green our planet, but also for more immediate environmental concerns in the surrounding people's, basic needs, air quality, and so on. Thank you. Last slide, please. Thank you. The last point's just food for thought, probably for people to think about later on when we talk or take it home with. So how do we think about the future? So I think when we think about who should do work, I think we have to, on one hand, really think about the role of the state and what I would call common good governance arrangements. This again, it cuts across the world, not just developing countries. The same applies for the so-called global north. But we also have to think about how we better include business in the private sector here, how we can make sure that we use the power and resource of the private sector adequately, not to speculate, not housing as a speculative tool, but housing as an active livelihood building tool and as a productive tool. I mentioned it before, the importance of data has been widely recognized. It's one of those key bits how capitalism actually works these days. But we have to think much further than this. It's not just data. We have to actually close the chain from data up to wisdom. So it's not just data and information, but knowledge and wisdom we need to gain and distribute and use as a benchmark for our actions. And that leads to the 4th point here, the thinking about how do we better use good practice, which is developed in, let's say, Latin America and Africa and Southern Asia, and how can, within the so-called global south, within the developing countries, we can create better learning, co-learning patterns and circuits, because we recognize that in many ways, developing countries can learn best from each other. The final point, and that again cuts across the whole wide world at the moment, I think one of the key, if not the key issue for the next couple of years and decades is how to bring together our concern for people, the social agenda around housing, with the ecological or the planetary agenda. And some people call it the olive agenda. So we have to really think about how to bring both together, and not to make sure that they are contradicting, and that poor people pay the price for bettering our planet. This is perhaps the biggest challenge, and I in this publication you find more food for thought. Thanks a lot, and hope you enjoy also this publication.
Thank you so much, Stefan. That last point on the olive agenda is really, does really sound like food for thought. Thank you so much all for sharing the findings of this very interesting publications. So we have heard about how the reverse gains on SDG 11.1 can impact the full SDG agenda, and the fact that investments in this area, if properly done, can definitely be crucial for the post-pandemic efforts. But now I'd like to hear from our other speakers. Claude, I will invite you. I would really like to hear your reaction to these different findings, and in your perspective, how relevant are housing-related SDGs in Africa, as well as their respective bottlenecks for their implementation. We can't hear you, sorry. Can you please unmute yourself? No, sorry, there is still an issue. If you mute yourself and unmute again, sometimes.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. So I was saying that I'm happy to take the floor on behalf of UN Habitat. And what you just raised and what we have just heard from the three colleagues is capture the essential of UN Habitat vision, which is to provide a better quality of life for all in an urbanizing world. When we take the SDG 11, for instance, we have at the global level programs which have contributed, and which the support of the latest evaluation done on the global housing program in UN Habitat demonstrate clearly the importance of us focusing on the SDG 11.1. And that regression is clearly demonstrated in that document. And one point I want to highlight here specifically is that when we look the participatory slum upgrading program that we have in Habitat, we have been striving for over years to work in different continents. But so far, the challenge is still ahead, and which clearly demonstrate that we need to revisit the tools we are using, and some of them have come under the recommendation made here. If I may want to add here is that it is data at the center and data for decision making. So how do we make sure that the data we have can help all the stakeholders, public at local and national level, but also private banking and individuals or household. So this is key to create enabling environment to put this SDG 11 at the heart of the center. So we definitely also believe through that global evaluation report of the housing program of UN Habitat that there is need for us to build a sound mechanism whereby we integrate Internet of Things to better assess this data gap, which could be used now to inform decision making. And one element that has to come on board here is the land, because land is taking value, and definitely land has to be factored in, and we have to harness through a densification approach. The second point, which we also believe that housing should be a catalyst for SDG, is that at Habitat we have put our plan under a framework, and one of the framework is that how can we use our current strategic plan globally to contribute to peace. And housing definitely is a tool for peace, because people are fighting to get better living condition and better housing condition. So and investing in housing will create and trigger new opportunity for industrialization and new opportunity for job creation for young people who are outside. And this is what UN Habitat is advocating for. Under this point, it has been mentioned as a recommendation, the 4P, partnership between people, public and private. And this is where the executive director of UN Habitat is also advocating for, so that we put people at the center, as we are putting housing at the center, because most of the blockage we have and we have observed is that in all the continent, basically in Africa, where we have more than 50% living in poor housing conditions. And during the first presentation, we realized that there was lack of interest on housing with affordability issues. is because usually we neglect the people, and we have to build cities with people. The other point, the last point concerning housing at the Center for Recovery, we issue during the COVID evolution, the report, or the policy rather, on housing and COVID, and it clearly demonstrated that 20% of the world population lack adequate housing. Why? Because the first motto of COVID, and that is why we support this idea, the first motto of COVID is stay at home. So how can we stay at home when we don't have enough facilities? Let's take, for example, internet, the digital divide that we have now. The COVID has clearly demonstrated that there is a huge digital divide, and by creating housing with accessibility, for instance, to internet, we create now new opportunity for schools, for working from home, and for other facilities. And that is why UN Habitat is currently piloting housing and COVID activities in different continents, where we are developing a policy dialogue and developing strategy at the local level. For instance, we have next month in Madagascar a dialogue on housing and housing right and industry in COVID context. We are currently working again with the local authorities in Cameroon to harness the potential of vulnerable groups, because they are the most affected. They are the ones who are renting, but they sometimes, with the COVID lockdown, they don't have financial resources to pay their rent. So how can we revisit this? And this is just to add, finally, that we need a strong housing dialogue mechanism to support the sustainable recovery. And the Habitat is putting an emphasis again on the last point mentioned by Stephen, the trust, because we need trust among all the stakeholders. It's only through trust that we can ensure that we have enabling environment where the funder or the financial institution can trust the public authorities, where public authorities can set up mechanisms and enforce them while working with the community. So this is basically overall saying that the importance of housing within the lens of the African Union and the EU collaboration could really put housing at the center. And this comes at the eve of the dialogue we've been having with the African Union, and we launched a book on COVID in urban context in Africa. So definitely, this solution and recommendation are what we are trying to push, and we are very happy that the GIZ, Cities Alliance, and other institutions, Habitat for Humanity, are really also taking this as core to the next agenda between the EU and African Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. Thank you so much. So indeed, a complexity of issues that justifies the interconnectedness that we face, and the reason why of putting housing at the centrality of the discussion. I would just like to remind our viewers to please, any questions you'd like to pose to our speakers, please feel free to use our question box, which we will address those questions at a later stage. Billy, now to you. We've heard from Claude that the cities need to be built up with people, right? We need to start there. So, I mean, having heard all these recommendations, I mean, in your view, how can we better address the role and ensure that the cities have a clear role for sustainable development in Africa?
Thanks, Andrea. I think it's essential we start with an analysis of and a reminder of exactly where we are at the moment, I hope at the middle or the hard end of the COVID-19. However, the COVID-19, as we've all said, has increased vulnerability in the cities that we're talking about. We have seen significant decreases in revenue and income at the household level, at the city level, and at national government level. And we, in many countries, are looking at new debt crisis, but almost across the board, the amount of fiscal space available to national and local governments has decreased. And we have seen in a number of areas reductions and cutbacks by donors. So we're in a worse position by far than we were 2 years ago. And of course, the impact, that's what at the big level, at the household level, we've had in Africa alone in the second quarter of 2020, a loss of 60 million full-time jobs. We've had reductions in earnings in the informal economy. and we've had contractions in GDP growth. I don't want to sound miserable, but we have to start from where we are. And so in the immediate short term, I see that it's very likely that the priorities are not going to be housing, but are most likely going to be a continuation of support in social protection, in health, in cash transfers and special allowances and grants, and in food and nutrition, because that's the climate in which we've based ourselves. When I come to the housing situation, I do think we need to have very clear messages about what are the priority steps that need to be taken now, and at the top of which is, in my view, make nothing worse. And so I would like to put right at the top of the agenda, preventing and opposing the continued forced evictions that we have seen in different cities in Africa, not just in the shelter and housing, but also affecting workers, informal workers. And we must remember that the informal economy produces over 80% of both male and female jobs in Africa. We need to have, again, protecting and fighting for the recognition of residents of those cities, which is what forced evictions threatens them with. And I would like to put right at the top of all donors' agendas the need to invest in organizations that represent the urban poor and put forward their case. But we do come to putting housing at the center and the role of the state. I'll say something that mustn't be misunderstood, but I would say in the context of where we are, housing is neither the primary problem nor the primary solution to what we are facing. It operates in a context where the enabling environment, and I think in Stephen's, his cross-cutting themes are in many ways my starting point. So many of the causes of bad housing, it's not necessarily lack of data or lack of knowledge. It is structural social exclusion, gender and race discrimination across the board, low or no wages, a lack of formal recognition in the city, and a lack of political representation. And I really believe that focusing on changing that environment, which translates in housing terms to a challenge to the local governments, those governments that have made most progress with their people are those that have provided a positive enabling environment that creates the conditions in which public investment attracts private entrepreneurs and matching investment primarily from the households themselves. So the key areas that local governments in an enabling environment would be to address, and here I'm with Claude. Number one is addressing the dysfunctionality of most urban land markets and providing urban poor residents with security, protection against arbitrary behavior by local government or national government officials. Secondly, the formal provision of services, hard services like water, access to sanitation, energy, but also the other critical services, health, and above all else, education. And as I've already mentioned, recognition and support. When those enabling conditions are provided on a citywide basis for all citizens, and the local government turns itself from opposing and trying to overregulate its urban poor and supporting them, then, to be perfectly frank, housing is very often the outcome, because the reality we have in most African cities, as we would have in a lot of South Asian cities, is that the majority of housing stock produced in the world today is produced either partially or totally by the urban poor themselves. And I see our primary challenge is trying to get public authorities to recognize that, not see it as a problem, but turn it into a force that really does put housing at the center, but on a realistic basis. So I put it to you that I do believe we can put housing at the center, but we have to make sure that we don't start from housing. We start from creating the conditions in which housing becomes possible. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Billy. Thank you so much. That was a very comprehensive overview, talking about enabling environments, indeed. And bearing that in mind and echoing your words about the fact that we need to make nothing worse, it would also be great to have a perspective now from EU member states, in which case, Martina, I would really like to ask you, I mean, considering everything we've heard so far, it would be great to hear a bit more about how central are housing relevant SDGs or about this enabling environment to German development cooperation in Africa, and what kind of approaches are actually taken to overcome their challenges, especially in the context of BMZ's urban development theme.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrea. First of all, I'd like to thank you and Habitat for Humanity International for inviting me and having me here to discuss with you on this important topic of housing. So we have been talking about SDG 11 and also other SDGs. I would like to start with making it even broader and stating that considering the fact that 2/3 of all SDG sub-goals can only be achieved in and with cities, and housing being an urban issue, housing is of course a central issue for the German development policy activity. And for this reason, BMZ has set itself the specific goal of promoting sustainable planned cities as part of the BMZ 2030 strategy. Under this strategy, the German Development Corporation promotes the creation of inclusive and affordable housing and helps cities design urban neighborhoods that are climate and environmentally friendly by using sustainable construction methods. So we support cities and city administrations and partner organizations such as NGOs and citizens' initiatives in upgrading informal areas and strengthening their local communities. So in this context, we see that not only the achievements of SDG 11 are addressed, but there is particular link to also SDG 12 as well, responsible consumption and production. Inter alia by integrating resource efficiency in the buildings and construction sector. So the German Development Corporation also contributes in this through the membership in the UN One Planet Network on Sustainable Buildings and Construction. At this interface, there's also an exchange and cooperation with international partners such as UN Habitat and UNEP, just to mention this level. And in addition, unemployment has risen enormously, what we also heard before, due to the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in many African countries. So in our view, the local building sector offers immense potential for promoting employment, for example, along local production chains of building materials. By using innovative production processes, local building materials, and nature-based solutions, we make climate protection and adaptation successful and provide adequate, safe, and affordable housing for all sections of the population. So giving you one example, in Zimbabwe, there's a project as part for improving municipal water and sanitation. We are also supporting solutions for dense and affordable housing construction using energy-efficient construction methods and the use of local, low-emission building materials. And since you asked for approaches of the German Development Corporation, I would like to focus and stress on three. So first, very important is recognizing and empowering cities as development actors in general. So cities must have the authority to make autonomous action and have a viable budget system to facilitate this sustainable urban development. This requires clear municipal responsibilities, and municipalities must have the requisite capacity to be regulated and fostered through national policies and legislation, so the famous framework conditions. Secondly, we see as very important the human-centered and human rights-based approach. Of course, this means we have to put the human beings and their well-being in the center of all actions. We, of course, follow the SDG principle of leave no one behind, which means the inclusion of all parts of the society in political and economic life and processes. And specifically, the use of participatory approaches is essential in order to meet the needs of all. So people are to be given prospects for the future. Thirdly, it's realizing integrated urban planning and development as another key approach. This issue means for affordable housing does not start with the construction itself, but rather much earlier. Urban planning and especially land tenure security can therefore be part of the solution for regulatory barriers strangling the housing supply. So, safe rights of ownership, land tenure security, formalization of land and property, and participative urban development guide our activities. Also, to give you one example in this respect, one project is going on in Namibia, and it deals with the implementation of land tenure system. So in selected communities, we are committed to developing and anchoring standards and orientation documents for urban land planning and participatory processes. We focus on including existing informal settlements and their inhabitants in the planning process and improve the residents' living conditions. So as a summary, we are convinced that a socially just, climate-friendly, integrated and resilience-fostering urban development will create livable cities for all and contribute to achieving the goals of the SDGs. Now, in the difficult times of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is, of course, ever more important that we agree on approaches to cooperation. We need to think and act across borders, and that means to strengthen partnership models between all the partners and to gain together for a better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martina. It is really great also to hear about this integrated approach that German Development Corporation is having in line with the interconnectedness that we've been hearing so much. I would like now also to pass the word to Paolo. So also in line with all the findings that we have heard, it would be great if you could please tell us more about the perspective of the European Commission around all these opportunities and challenges brought in by the Decade of Action and considering the context we're currently living.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Okay, good. So I would like, before to go to the European Commission, I would like to say that your documents are very stimulating for a discussion. I've been spent a lot of time yesterday trying to go through. And for me, there are a couple of things that are interesting to address. This positioning of housing at the center of development, which is quite a strong statement. And then the fact that the SDG 11 or let's say urban development is not only SDG 11 but is everywhere. And we have been very strongly supported the localization of the SDG and the Development Agenda 2030. But what are a little bit the consequence of these two statements, let's say, or these two remarks? We are in the Commission. We are now building the ongoing financial framework that goes from 2021 to 2027, and we are doing around 5 high-level objectives: the Green Deal, the digital transformation, the jobs and growth, the migration, peace and security, and the human development. And of course, you can see that all these are urban development of cities are everywhere. No need to say that. Also, I want to say that we are having a principle of geographizing our intervention. So we reduce to the maximum the global funding for global programs, and we try to do more at national and regional levels. So I'm following very carefully whatever we are doing with our colleagues in the different countries with the support of the EU delegations. And we see a little bit the dark coin, the dark side of the coin, because basically we have a kind of fragmentation, because we see that urban development of cities, housing is included in many aspects, but at the end we will work on the Green Deal, we will work on the digital transformation, we will work on the migration, and we will lose, let's say, by working on this kind of sectorial approach, we will lose the concept of integrated urban development, because the fact will be that in fact, in a country, we will probably work, I don't know, in climate change, we will work on energy, we will work on transport, but this will be difficult to put under the chapeau of integrated urban development. And here a little bit comes also the discussion on the housing, because it's true that housing is very important, but I'm sure that if I share this with my colleagues in the Commission, DG INPA, everybody will say that this is a kind of overstatement to say that housing is at the center of development. Because although we recognize that this is very important, at the end of the day, the fact that housing is central for sustainable development doesn't translate automatically in the fact that donors would have large housing programs. And this distinction is important, in my opinion, because at the end of the day, when we talk about housing, there is, let's say, something that goes with the financing. We are supposed, let's say, to provide the public goods, especially. This is so basically we are working on improving situation on slums. This is obvious, but when it comes to housing per se, this is really something that is done by a lot by private sector, is a lot by the same people that is living in the house. So this is something that we can support, let's say, a little bit indirectly. And this is, for example, we have a large menu of tools from technical assistance to capacity building to budget support to countries at a national and also a subnational level. We have our innovative financing instruments. So basically what we do is to, for example, work for the security of tenure. We are working for the provision of basic services. We try to incentivize housing by providing services in a certain area to connect water to electricity. Another important thing that we do, we try to reduce risks through guarantee instruments that can attract investors for housing. We are working also on the housing value chains, reducing the cost of housing supply, standardized solution, and then of course all the discussion on sharing knowledge and technical assistance, supporting governments and local authorities. This is what we can do. And so as a donor, we have to use all these instruments, and it's difficult to say that we put housing at the center of the development. We of course we look at housing, but this is almost the end. It's not the starting point. That is where I think that there is a little bit of difference in our approach. I think that using grants alone will not bring us very far. So basically, what we do is mainly on this is to help to target critical constraints for unlocking other donors and to bring to scale investment. This is a little bit what we will do more, I think, in urban development and of course in housing, and basically bringing a blending finance, which is a mixing of grants with public and private loans, or with guarantees or whatever, and trying to thinking that this will be a critical element to persuade borrowers to adopt more inclusive social green elements in the investment. And of course, this would be important because to match with grants, not only in the investment, but then to use grants and technical assistance to support, let's say, the public sector. I hope that I have been able to be short and clear on this. Happy to continue, let's say, in the second round.
Absolutely, thank you so much. It was very clear, and I do see a lot of common points with some of the previous speeches we had. I would just like to invite all of us to get together around the screen, and we do have a lot of common points, and I would just now invite our authors of the 3 publications, please, having heard the reactions from the different organizations and institutions, is there one key point that you would like to stress related to the main recommendations your research has led to? For example, Leah, is there any kind of point you would like to stress in connection with your paper? Even though we cannot see you now?
I can start maybe.
Exactly. Please, yes.
I would continue where Mr. Ciccarelli discussed about the European Green Deal, because what is interesting in European Green Deal is the renovation wave, which is of the buildings, which is a key point. And I think this will really support the housing sector, because it will be like a big initiative, and it will create like many jobs, because the renovations of buildings also require like are labor oriented, and they will create probably many jobs, and this is like a job sector from housing sector created. And they also will reach like energy efficiency of the buildings. We can reduce the energy costs and the climate impact of the buildings. And also like apart from the from the building itself, will create like a more complex and sustainable neighborhoods as well, by investing in these old European buildings. Like it is supposed to create like 160,000 new jobs, and renovation of, if I'm not mistaken, 35 million inefficient buildings. So I would say that European Green Deal, it's in a way motivated to all the renovation of the houses and housing sector.
Thank you so much. That's a great connection, connecting the dots. And Leah, is there a point from your findings that you would like to stress, having heard all the interventions, please?
Thank you. I think many of these interventions were quite high level, so I'm a bit embarrassed, because because this can be subject of very, very interesting discussions, and but how we connect to this very specific recommendation is, I see a couple of points. One of them is related actually to position housing at the center. And I felt that there's going to be discussion around that, and I think that's a very important point. If we see housing as a result or as the cause of things, and yes, I think this is actually both. So for that reason, one of the issues I think we want going to discuss is that with Katerina, we were really thinking hard about how to address this multi-causality of continued slum growth, because there are macro factors. There is urbanization, climate change, and there are all these systemic inequalities, which is again, and there are the factors which are closer to housing and urban policies. So this is at least 3 levels. at this point, I think we cannot really address the issue of urbanization and climate change, because these are really macro level things. Out of William's intervention, we can just think about how to address systemic inequalities. So we have to think about how, so not stopping at this smaller scene of housing, but in the end, I think just because housing is not only maybe the cause of everything, but also it can be an outcome, I think this doesn't make housing at the center approach invalid. And one of these recommendations we made, in fact, was putting housing at the center. And actually, we tried to make it a bit more specific, and we formed quite a lot of these recommendations, very specific recommendations, for instance, for national government to review and improve national legislation to make more effective urban planning systems, may provide local governments with adequate mandates and resources for action, so there can be things done, promote a rights-based approach. So I think this, many of what we heard actually links well with this type of recommendations. But yeah, we can put housing in a broader context, obviously, and we can challenge systems and right.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry.
So much for now.
No, but thank you so much. It's indeed very much, we tend to always come back to the good old metaphor of the chicken or the egg. But Stefan, would you like also to stress in that context some key connection with your points, please?
Sure. Can you hear me? Yeah? Good. Now, it's actually really interesting to listen to all the speakers. Thank you for your really interesting feedback. I'm just reflecting on what I heard, and I think there's sort of one gap opening up, and that is that when we think about interventions now, as I think Paolo just said, it's a lot about sectoral interventions around, green deals, particular industries, particular sectors. And housing is almost a funny one, which is almost sort of in between and hard to grasp in terms of donor support and environmental developmental policies. Now, on the other hand, we recognize that housing, actually, that the biggest need for housing and the biggest site for change are cities and municipalities. So and we see that cities and municipalities at the moment losing power in terms of national politics. They are losing power because they are lacking the resources, but have more work to do. I do think we have to think much more about cities, how to empower cities. So I think Martina's point, your first point of your three frameworks, recognize and empower cities as key sites for housing mediated changes is the key one in Europe as well as in other countries. Because national politics at the moment threatens to undermine some of the real necessary changes on localities and on cities. So we have to think about how to utilize and empower more cities, and how to do this globally. And then I think we have a more direct access to housing interventions. So this is probably one of the key messages I hear from today. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then I would like actually all our speakers to have a last round of thoughts. So Claude, I'll turn to you again. In your perspective, we've heard about many different approaches and many different instruments. If we can place the specific focus on the new partnership between EU and Africa, what kind of mechanisms do you think that should definitely be in place to address all the challenges that we've heard? We can't hear you. No, not yet, sorry. Sorry, Claude, we can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself and mute yourself and unmute to see if it works?
Okay, now I was saying the organization has muted me because I could not activate from this end.
Sorry, sorry.
Thank you. So I think you mentioned the kind of mechanism that we can put in place. I think, first of all, thank you to all the speakers, because we are converging, probably with different perspectives, but I think the aim is really to improve the living conditions or the standard of life or of citizens. The first thing I see here, based on what you have just said, is that we need high-level policy dialogues with decision makers at the top level to really bring them to understand the determinant role of local authorities as key actors in the process of change. Okay, because the way I see housing as a center, for me, housing is an outcome or an impact, but we also do recognize that in some contexts, if you live in a good house, you may already have resolved part of your problem. And I think the first part of the first presentation clearly highlight the housing on affordability. So the first thing is the high-level policy dialogue on adequate housing or adequate living conditions in cities and urban development in cities. The second point I see here is that in Africa, we have rules. Maybe they are not sufficient enough. We have procedure. Maybe they are not well implemented. So therefore, we have been thinking with the African Union how to establish a charter, which has now been called a model law on housing and urban development. So the purpose here is to really see how we can harmonize the principle and regulations that we have, but also the procedure to be able to easily follow up and then monitor and report on housing and urban development progress in Africa, because the situation is that there is lack of compliance with rules. And this is my third point. How do we bring together national authorities, local authorities, and the citizen to comply with urban rules and regulations? If we do it, definitely we are going to improve the housing living condition. But in order to do it, we have to have the president accountable. We have set up in UN Habitat what we call the Presidential Initiative for Sustainable Urbanization. How do we, through the EU and the AU mechanism, strengthen this? But how do we also revive, although I think Bill Corbett was one of those who created the AMSHUD, the African Ministerial Conference on Housing and Urban Development. It has been transferred to the African Union, but now it's almost dead since 2014. So this is what I call high-level policy, but also support to national and local government to really foster and improve compliance with rules. The other point here, we cannot improve this or enhance this without a framework for multi-institutional coordination at all levels, because many interventions are sectoral, they are disintegrated, so we need multi-institutional coordination at different sectors, and this will be the key to the 4P, people, private, and population partnership to deliver what we want to see, what the change we want to see in terms of living conditions. And finally, we cannot do it without piloting. The new urban agenda is clear. When we have the principle, which are inclusion, innovation, and integration, we have to test it somewhere. We have been saying that we have to fix things. How do we, for example, in this forum, call all together and have a pilot somewhere with all the institutions here present and say, yes, it has worked or it hasn't worked? These are the elements that I wanted to put forward. And lastly, during the last World Urban Habitat Day, World Habitat Day in Surabaya, the Minister of Cameroon, who was speaking on behalf of the ministers in Africa, called for a global action on decent and affordable housing for all in Africa. So can we then tap on this mechanism through the EU and African Union mechanism to leverage on what we have been proposing here? Thank you, and over.
Thank you so much, Billy. I'm not sure if I can ask you, can we consider this kind of mechanism? But I would also like to ask you to react to everything we just heard, specifically in terms of this specific solutions that were just mentioned, but also factoring in another element that I don't think it was brought up yet today, which is this other mega trend that we're observing in Africa, which is the rapid growth of young people, right? So how do we actually support this role that cities might have for sustainable development, considering all the mechanisms that we discussed? And I know this on its own could be a whole new thesis, but are there any kind of complementary points that you would like to highlight in that context?
Yeah, well, thank you. It's not I'll do what I can in 2.5 minutes, but the reality is when most national African governments, and not just in Africa, when they talk about housing, they're not referring to housing for the very poorest. When you see an announcement that we are signing a deal to provide 100,000 houses or whatever, and it's in the papers on the front page, I can give you a written guarantee that will go to the top 10% of the population. It will not address. And the real question is, how do you get housing for the very poorest? For most national governments, this is not a priority. No matter what they say in speeches, it is not a priority. And if housing at the center can turn into changing that debate, that will be useful. But I'm with Paulo here. I think we need to be cautious about saying one thing is at the center of development, because it sounds self-serving, and if this, why not that? And it tends to get overreaction. Second is, we all say, and with Cities Alliance, we promote the role of cities. In truth, most of the cities that we're talking about have neither the authority nor the resources, human and otherwise, to do the things that we all saying they have to do. And so a key part of this is what Martina was pointing to, is the strengthening of local governments. And if I have to make my choices, and I often do, I don't ever start with SDG 11. I always start with number 16, peace, security, contracts, institutions. Without that, you can whistle. Nothing's going to happen. And institutions both in the public sector and in the non-state sector. And that's why I stress the importance of investing in organizations. I go back to my central thesis. No matter what is said, the default position of most governments is anti-poor. If you look at how their budgets are structured, how they behave, what they actually do, that's the mindset and behavior we have to change. Because until you've got a policy environment which recognizes the role, the citizenship of all residents, and I know it's the simplest thing to say, but it's the most difficult to achieve. Housing technically is not difficult. If you want to know how to produce lots of houses rapidly and cost effectively and environmentally, we have the skills. That's not where the challenge is. It's not missing technology. It's not missing data that's the problem. It's the policy approach to the majority of people in the cities. That's where the fight is.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Martina, now in connection also with the previous points that you highlighted, I mean, you also mentioned BMZ 2030 reform. So can we pinpoint specific opportunities that are brought in that context to make sure that the sector can advance?
Yes, sure. Yeah, so as it is, the strategy of a ministry is in the first one a quite broad one. Within the strategy, there are 5 core areas, and one of them is called responsibility for our planet. Climate and energy is addressed here, and under this area also lies sustainable urban development as one field of action. And it includes also mobility and circular economy. So it's still quite broad. But under that, as I mentioned before in my first part, also addressing integrated development and addressing informal settlements specifically is mentioned. So included, of course, also in the strategy is the further main target of capacity development in our partner countries. Well, given the prevailing gap in sustainable buildings and infrastructure, sustainable urban development can only be successful through global turnaround in the construction housing sector. This is still our belief. Means construction of all buildings required by 2050 alone would consume up to 80% of the global CO2 budget of the 1.5 degree target. So that means when using conventional materials like cement, steel, and aluminium. So that is a great opportunity we see, and the BMZ sees, here to mitigate the economic and social consequences of the pandemic, also for long-term recovery and simultaneously contribute to a more sustainable housing sector. So that means BMZ's other approach is to recover forward, and that means environmentally friendly and socially just development that consistently aligns investments with the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Climate Agreement. So we must not only build back better, but invest with foresight, and so that sustainability and resilience succeed in everything we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there are indeed many synergies. We already heard before about the Green Deal, BMZ, GIZ. There's the same kind of approach in the BMZ 2030 reform. Paolo, are there any more prospects that we could have identified? You already for the future, specifically now in the context of Team Europe, for example, and it's working in Africa. You already mentioned some of the instruments that are being prioritized within the narrative of not having housing at the center per se, but are there any other kind of mechanisms or opportunities you can identify, including in the context of SDG 16, of improving governance, as was mentioned before?
Yes, I don't know if this answered to your question, but I see two main issues where we should work. The first one is linked to the strengthen the capacity of local authorities, and there we have the Commission has a big program for this, because this is probably the starting point. Local authorities, local government has not the capacity, and especially have not funds to do anything. So we are making a lot of efforts to try to look at this specific problem of financing, trying to see how local authorities can increase, let's say, local revenues, things like land value, something like this. And second is how to assess external financing that has to do with the creditworthiness and the capacity of municipalities to enter in these kind of agreements. This for us is the starting point. And then of course you link this to the, as I say, to the integrated urban development, because in my opinion, you can do, yes, we have been, Caterina said about, you know, good things done with the Green Deal for buildings, but you know, we have to look at for example, to Africa. And when we talk about energy efficiency in Africa, I'm sorry to shoot on my feet, but you know, this project at the end are a lot to do with making yes, policy, and then to maybe to change bulbs or to change the window frames and things like that. If I don't want to say in Africa, I give you the example of Italy. We have a big funds for energy efficiency. 85 of the incentives has been given to change the window frames. So this is nothing to do with urban development. So we have to find a way where we work on traffic management, on a solution for sustainable mobility. We try to exploit the potential of digitalization, smart cities. We work on waste management. Another example, we work a lot now on this blue economy and oceans. But I've been following a program in Italy where in the Mediterranean Sea, 50% of the plastic comes from Egypt. That means rather than to work in all the sea, you just need to work in Cairo, and you get already 50% of the plastic there produced. So why don't you engage in Cairo and look how to establish a system of solid waste management. So, and then the other things that I want to come back to what Billy said. When we talk about housing, we are covering, when we have this housing scheme, that anyway, we have also some pilot project on see how to develop social housing. But if we want to cover the poor and we want to have an impact, we have to work on slums. And how do you work on slums is by providing public services. The first thing is to give water, to give again, waste management, to give electricity. This is what we have to do to reduce inequality. We cannot start building houses. This is not our main, I would say, target. We are completely outside this. We have some projects where we are trying to provide, let's say, guarantees for social housing schemes, and this is working well in South Africa, in Kenya, in some countries. Only there is possible, I think. Not everywhere. In Northern Africa, of course, is much more possible. But our big intervention should be concentrated on slums, where it's the people that is suffering. Also, we mentioned the COVID and the pandemic situation, and it's clear that the people that is living in slum is suffering more than the others, let's say. Imagine to keep the distance when you are living 10 people in 10 square meters. This is the real problem now that is affecting millions and millions of people, especially in Africa, but also in the other regions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We've heard. This is a very broad agenda. We've heard indeed interconnectedness is in all fronts, even though the approaches might not always be the same. But the centrality of housing, even though it does not have to be the central sector, I understand there are different approaches, is cross-cutting for this agenda for sustainable development and all its different dimensions, as it was introduced before. We're running a bit out of time, so I would like to ask our viewers or speakers if there is any kind of burning issue, because otherwise I would pass the words to Chris so that we can close the session, as we're past time already. So if one of you would like to say something, any kind of burning last point that you feel you need to stress, I'll be grateful if you could let us know. No, but if not, Chris, thank you so much. The floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Andrea. And I have the significant challenge of trying to close out and review what was all discussed. So, but first, let me thank all the panelists. It was a fabulous conversation, and certainly a critical conversation for all of us to think about in the current environment in which we live. Let me just try and cover some of the bases that we heard from. First, we heard from Leah about target 11.1 and how it's only one of 5 targets regressing out of the 169 SDG targets. We know that access to adequate and affordable housing is a critical element of this target, and this reversal of previous progress illustrates the global housing crisis that continues to affect millions around the world. Second, she highlighted the fact that this also doesn't really include the issue of affordability, which is certainly affecting all populations globally, and which means the crisis is likely worse than we even recognize. We heard from Katerina, who spoke about the linkages of housing to the SDGs and how it's really kind of interconnected with all of them, and certainly directly connected, and a good argument can be made, directly connected to 7 of the new goals, and would encourage you to read the new publication and look at the booklet that serves as a useful resource for better understanding the transformational impact of housing on the 2030 agenda. We heard from Stephen about how there were severe housing gaps before COVID, and that the pandemic has clearly accelerated the housing challenges. And he put in place an interesting framework, the value system for housing, that he highlights in his paper, and I would encourage you all to look at that. We heard from Claude, who spoke about the problems of the data gap and how better data might help with slum upgrading, and that housing can support job creation and economic growth. We heard from Billy, who stressed the reality where we are globally, frankly, in the fiscal space, and the urgent needs for immediate support directly to citizens. There's an urgent need to continue to ensure people are protected from forced evictions, and the need to urge donors to invest in supporting especially slum populations in the current environment. Billy also stressed that social exclusion, lack of wages, and really lack of political support are the primary drivers for poor housing, and the governments working to support their citizens have the most success in addressing housing challenges. The governments need to create the proper enabling conditions for all their citizens to have a positive impact. We heard from Martina, who took a step back from the housing and looked really more at sustainable cities and helping to address climate change and reduce poverty and ensure that better planned cities with sustainable materials and resources and services can have bigger impacts. We heard from Paolo speaking about the new financial planning happening around Africa and the EU and the relationship between existing priorities and maybe unfortunately not as focused on integrated urban development and housing and how they're more sectorally organized, and really how housing is likely an indirect focus of all of these efforts. And then collectively, I think we heard a lot of synergies around the need to empower municipalities and think about addressing housing more indirectly by creating the proper pro-poor policy environments, especially in slums, to help reduce inequality by providing public services. So from a habitat perspective, we certainly believe that housing can have a transformational impact on individuals and communities, that home is a safe place to foster stability and security, that it can boost economic recovery and provide employment. We absolutely know that adequate and affordable housing leads to benefits in health and education and economic opportunities. I've seen this very clearly through our work. In Africa, we have programs in Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Kenya, Lesotho, Liberia, Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda, and Zambia. And we work throughout 10 EU member states, and we've worked to actively support SDG 11, the entire SDG framework, and we've contributed to the EU position on Habitat 3 and the new European Consensus on Development. We know urbanization in Africa is progressing rapidly. It's a significant issue. Africa is a pioneer in implementing the new urban agenda, but the continent faces severe challenges posed by the high rate of unplanned urbanization and the effects of the climate. The importance of housing has also been reaffirmed during the COVID-19 pandemic. The crisis has contributed to the aggravation of pre-existing and other systemic inequalities. The pandemic threatens the implementation of the SDGs. We need to recognize the complexity of the housing ecosystem and adapt integrated approaches if we're going to succeed in addressing it. We have great challenges and great opportunities, and with your help, we will meet them and ensure the decade of action can effectively deliver on the SDGs. I want to give special thanks to Cities Alliance and UN Habitat, our collaborators, for the entire series of webinars on the EU-Africa Partnership, and the EU for financial support for the Build Solid Ground project. Once again, thanks for joining us for the discussion, and I'll turn it back to Andrea.
Thank you so much, Chris. Indeed, there's so much we can take from this discussion. There is a lot of heads. As it was mentioned, there's a lot of black sides of the coin, but there are also a lot of opportunities that we hope we can leverage and that we can build upon together, and that we can continue this dialogue. On my side, I would just really like to thank you, all the speakers, for all your brilliant input. I learned a lot. It was extremely interesting. It was an extremely interesting debate. And of course, our viewers for having joined us. I hope you had a great time. I definitely did. And I hope we can keep a dialogue from now on. See you very soon, and stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.